Foundation of Finland. Noora, take it away.
Thank you. I'll wait for things to be set up. And in the meantime, good afternoon, everyone. Just to make sure everyone feels comfortable sitting an hour more before the coffee break, if you have room and don't have a laptop and everything piled up in your lap, stand up. Do so, most of you at least. You'll feel grateful later on. If you have room, just actually stretch a little bit. Great. You'll feel your legs again. Perfect. Now you can sit. Thank you so much. Panelists, you are welcome to join me, and I'll start presenting you once you've sat down. Perfect. So I'll be repeating a few things that we've been saying earlier already. So as especially Geisha has been saying, please remember to silence your phone. This panel will be lasting for an hour, and unfortunately there won't be a Q&A, but do follow the hashtag and have questions there, and we'll be coming back to those later on. So I'll be presenting you our panelists for this topic today. So next to me I've got Maxim Eristavi. Hopefully I'm saying your name right. He's a research fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He's also a Ukrainian writer, media entrepreneur, and civil rights advocate. He's one of the most well-known English-speaking journalists stationed in Eastern Europe and serves as a founding consultant for the Russian language news exchange, which is the biggest support network for independent newsrooms in Eastern Europe. He's also co-founded an independent news startup, and he's been a contributor for various news outlets. Welcome. Then next to him, we've got Nigel Gwilliam. He's a consultant head of media and works at this emerging tech-focused company at the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising, so the IPA. His position, he's charged with understanding the implications of emerging technologies in advertising and agencies, so kind of bringing a different perspective into the discussions today. He's got 20-plus experience in media and digital media, working both for media agencies and media companies. He's currently responsible for representing the media and digital communities within IPA membership, and in addition to that, he's running the IPA Media Futures Group and oversees the IPA's digital and technology groups. That's a long list of things you're working on. And finally, we've got another person from Finland, Anneli Ahonen. She's the StratCom task force editor of Disinformation Review. And if you've heard of the site EU versus disinfo.eu, she works for that too. Before joining the StratCom task force, Anneli Ahonen was working as a foreign reporter for the Finnish national broadcasting company Yleisradio. For 8 years, she's been reporting for the biggest Finnish newspaper, Helsingin Sanomat, from Russia, St. Petersburg, and covered, among other topics, Russia's disinformation campaigns. So we've got journalism very much covered here. We understand the situation in Russia, hopefully pretty well. So we'll be able to cover propaganda and disinformation, but also what is advertising and how it affects us. So I'm going to be laying the ground for the discussion, and then one by one you'll be giving your presentation and your point of view to this. So we'll be repeating a few things that we've been hearing today, which is about what I'll be calling content confusion. And whilst Jed Willer just said in his presentation, or by concluding it, that we are not confused anymore, I'm going to claim that most of us are. And that's because when you think of the internet era and social media platforms, what other kind of platforms you have for communication, content creators, whether they're professionals or bloggers, you name it, so many other ways of sharing content online, that has made it more challenging than ever for people to identify the purposes or methods of and for content creation. Ads can resemble journalistic pieces. A news story about politics can end up being propaganda. A story shared as a scientific study can be pseudoscience, or content can actually be forged without any real truth basis. So Professor Mara Einstein called this phenomenon content confusion. And that is when traditional genres and the way content is portrayed gets mixed up and melted into one another. When content confusion occurs, it may be challenging for online users and society at large to differentiate what is editorial content, what is advertising, and what is made up or really truly fake news. So in this panel, we will discuss about various aspects of this kind of content confusion, how it is created, by who, and more importantly, how should this issue be tackled and who should be responsible. We've been talking about regulation and having a strategic approach to understanding things that happen, but we're going to focus on these 3 words today and how content confusion can be tackled. So please, Maxim, do start.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for coming. I will start to say that it's great company to be here, but also I'm not kind of academics smart type of person. I'm street smart. That's what I'm going to talk about my experiences with Frontlines and how we deal with disinformation on Frontlines. Personally and professionally, I come before you today as a someone who has been terribly bruised by disinformation, both on personal and professional level. As professionally, as a journalist, I come from the region that has been scorched by disinformation in terms of press freedoms, in terms of independent journalism, where it's very hard to do your job as a journalist being attacked by barrage of disinformation every day, every minute, I would say. As a person on a personal level, coming as before you as Georgian Ukrainian, I also know and observe how disinformation kills people every day in terms of front lines that those countries like Ukraine or Georgia fight against Russian invasion. As a queer person, I also come and stand before you as someone who sees his community being attacked by disinformation and disinformation being utilized in fueling violence against many minorities, including queer community. And, as just on extremely personal level, I come from a family that is horribly divided by disinformation, where brothers and sisters and siblings and mothers and fathers don't talk to their kids or their family members or just have troubles connecting because of the effect of disinformation. But I'm not going to roll with all this drama and tragedy because I come here for you to tell you good news that we actually know a lot more about disinformation these days, just enough to start tackling it successfully. And the second good news that we've been doing a lot of great work on the front lines, and that work has been quite a success addressing disinformation. So the lesson that we learned in recent years is obviously that we heard a lot of these days, and now it's this mainstream idea is how disinformation works. That actually does not create anything new, that it does not, has a purpose of convince people, rather is just there to already thrive on the fault lines within our own democracies. The other important thing about the lessons that we learn is actually comes from the fact that we shouldn't overestimate the power of disinformation. Because in recent days, a lot of people come at me and say, it's very hard to work on this issue because we have adversaries that are so well-funded, they have so many great tools. And it is true indeed, because fun fact, I was working for Russian state media at some point during the period when disinformation was just emerging. And it is horrible, but also exciting startup culture happening over there. And there is a lot of creativity, a lot of ideas flowing, but at the same time, when we talk about those gigantic funds that everybody likes to cite, most of those money go to corruption. Most of those money are being stolen, so it doesn't mean that those great budgets are being appropriated within that startup culture. But the most important lesson for me as a journalist is there is no coincidence that the areas that the most affected by disinformation, organized disinformation these days, are those that suffer from crisis in the media sector of the different sorts. And most importantly, crisis when it comes to absence or complete absence of local media, whether it's in the US, whether it's in the EU, or whether it's in Ukraine or Georgia. The places that are affected and the societies that are affected by disinformation the most are those that do not have or have very weak local media or media environment. And, to end on a positive note, what we can actually do now, what we can do and what we're doing. Well, first of all, we're pushing the debate. That's great that we have such events and they're well attended because, again, coming from Ukraine and doing this information topic for 6 years, almost 6 years, I'm glad that you're finally all woke and you actually talk about and pushing this discussion further. It's important to have such statements as President Macron did the other day about creating those task forces that will help to expose disinformation influence of our democracies and actually protect them. It's important that we have such a great visionaries who would push this idea, such as Atlantic Council and the Disinfo initiatives and people like Geisha Gonzalez and Alina Porekova. But the most important thing that we can do is also focus on case studies, because case studies are everything. Because it's a startup culture, because we don't have any single golden rule about how disinformation works effectively, initiatives like we have now, Ukraine Election Task Force, that looks at specific countries, at specific point of history, and learning lessons from there, because whatever is deployed there, it will come back to other democracies as we learn. And also supporting independent journalism, the initiative that I'm part of, which is Russian Language News Exchange, which was daring idea, nobody believed it. We came together, we set up this exchange and support network for independent newsrooms in the most affected by disinformation areas in Eastern Europe. Now we reach 40 million people every month, and this is some kind of a scheme that we believe can be replicated in any region, because it's important at the end of the day to talk to those audiences that are affected by disinformation. As my family, when I come to my family at the end of the day, I want to have some bricks for building a bridge to them, because they're not uneducated, they're not stupid, and they choose disinformation just because they're scared, they feel alienated, the topics that they care are not covered, and the issues that they care are dismissed. So that's where important for us to go and try to reach them, and the best tool is obviously still a good journalism.
Thank you. Moving on to Nigel.
Yeah, I think, thank you very much for that. That was a really interesting introduction. Just conscious that the picture of me is so old it's approaching fake advertising. So apologies for that. I'm a little bit older, longer in the tooth than when that picture was taken. I'm obviously, as hopefully you'll guess from my accent, English, and so I'm obviously very glad that this event is taking place before March 29th, when a little decision or not possibly may be happening. So my country's basically been turned into a global scale car crash, thanks in part, certainly at least, to our friends in the east, the further east, in Ukraine, obviously. So for my own personal interests, I know that isolating Britain is a key geopolitical goal of the Kremlin. However, I'm here in a professional capacity. Unusually for this room, I'm an ad man. So you can point your finger at me and blame me for most things. Although I've met some very interesting people here that, like arms dealers and things, that seem to think that advertising is a source of all ills as well. But I will try and take some of the flack. But I'm going to try and talk to you about some constructive and positive things from an advertising perspective. So the organisation I work for is called the IPA, the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising. It's very grand sounding. It's over 100 years old. But it's actually incorporated by Royal Charter. So what that means is, as well as representing the advertising agency community in the UK, so our members handle something like 85% of UK advertising, we also have a responsibility to look out for the theory and the practice of advertising to best benefit the general public. That's actually written into our Royal Charter. And that really is the foundation of some of the initiatives that we've been involved in that are particularly pertinent to this space. And I was very conscious, very much agree with Clint Watt's comments earlier on about the tremendous danger of domestic actors in a political sphere, learning from the Russian playbook. And I think that progression from kind of Russian influence to the lessons learned from the Russians is a big concern. So we did something pretty unusual. We actually called for a ban on online political micro-targeting back in April of last year. Frankly, when an advertising trade association is calling for a ban of any kind of advertising, things are pretty serious. And that really is the case with regard to this. So politics in a democracy requires discussion in the public square. Dark social posts hidden in almost all and existing only ephemerally threaten this. We don't believe that it's intrinsic to have public square debate about sports cars or luxury holidays, which are the kinds of things my members kind of advertise. It also helps. I don't represent the businesses that are involved in political micro-targeting. They aren't run by mainstream agencies that you would have heard of. We know the names of them now, some of them at least, the Cambridge Analytica, the SELs, the AIQs, etc. But we don't represent them. The second thing we called for was actually a public, searchable registry of every political ad message that runs. And the reason why we did that was, it may come as a surprise to you, but every kind of advertising, certainly in the UK, is covered by regulation and self-regulation, except for political advertising. So you can't make a health claim about a breakfast cereal unless you can back it up factually. That's not true for making a political statement. So when you combine the fact that there is no regulatory or self-regulatory oversight with the fact that you can then target very, very small numbers of people with a hidden message that only you and they see, that's a very toxic combination open to abuse. I think fundamentally we can't expect regulation in the UK, I would guess elsewhere anytime soon, because guess what? Politicians like regulating other people. They don't like regulating themselves so much. They're not willing to relinquish any control to someone else to what they can say, because they think it'll always be biased against them. But listening also to Rachel Levine, sorry I didn't catch how to pronounce your surname earlier, from talking about the Irish abortion referendum, and indeed micro-targeting and how they explored that. Transparency is the next best option in the absence of regulation. So sunlight is the best antiseptic. That is the firm belief that we have. And it's why we've actually renewed our call for an independently hosted, publicly searchable registry of all political messages that run in the UK on a paid-for basis. So it would have the targeting information, it would have who paid for it, and it would obviously have a listing of the imagery and the messaging. Because if you can't regulate, the next best thing you can have is make that available to other political parties and to investigative journalists, which is something like a macro-scale version of the exercise in Ireland, and on an ongoing basis. We made a submission to the DCMS Select Committee on Fake News. I believe you've got Damien Collins on the stage tomorrow, who's a former ad man as well, so he's obviously he's a political guy now. But they, amongst many other things, have made a similar call. So they've said that that kind of transparency needs to be delivered by a central point. Crucially, it can't be managed solely by any one platform. Facebook's done some good work on this, but it shouldn't be down to them. It should be independently hosted, and it should be platform neutral. So that's fundamentally what we're calling for. I'll just make a couple of final points. One thing that we want to do to try and limit the micro-targeting piece is you pay for every kind of creative you use, not how much money you spend, every kind of creative you use. You need to have some metric that carries the volume of work to be reviewable and hosted to the money that you're making. So I think the Trump campaign used something like 5.9 million different ad formats. In the way that we would recommend setting this up, you would have to pay, a fraction of a pound or a dollar for every single one of those that you used to then be hosted. So that's the kind of technical expertise we can provide to the government. Fundamentally, it needs regulation. It needs the involvement of the political class and community in that. Just one final point on transparency. There is an interesting case at the moment. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Mainstream Network. Has anyone heard of the mainstream network? So no one knows what the mainstream network is. No one knows. Someone knows at the back. So, so broadly speaking, no one knows who's behind the mainstream network. We have one person in the room who knows it. So they've spent £250,000 on a very hard, specific version of the pro-Brexit message. No one knows who they are. There's no transparency. Facebook is believed to know, but they're currently not sharing that information. So there's still some work to do with that transparency. I'll leave it there. I hope that's useful. I'm just an ad man, so I'm not going to talk a great deal about journalism or propaganda, although, to be honest, a lot of the advertising industry in the UK emerged from the propaganda business during the war, so there is a bit of an overlap. Anyway,
Thank you. Go ahead, Anneli.
Thank you. So maybe I'll just start with a bit of an introduction of my perspective, how I joined this discussion, and maybe try to relate a bit with the other speakers as well. So I was especially happy to hear you, Maxim, sharing your experience, because it's in a way the origin of our team, how our team started its work. And just to give a brief update on what is happening in Brussels and on the institutional level. So when the first time when the EU member states recognized Russian disinformation as a threat was in 2015, and as a first step, the StratCom task force was set up to address and raise awareness about Russia's ongoing disinformation campaign. At that point in Brussels, the level of awareness of Russia's actions was really low, and now through 3 years we have come to the point when last December, an EU action plan against disinformation was published, and it also recognizes clearly Russia as the main threat of disinformation in Europe. So in a way, that is one indicator to clearly say that the level of awareness of Russia's actions has grown in Brussels. When our part of the EU institutional work against disinformation, where the action plan outlines 4 different strands, improving detection capacity, joining up efforts with the member states and institutions, the Commission's wider work with code of practice and social media companies, and then the long-term media literacy work. Then our team's part of that is to focus on Russia and do public communication work, raising awareness about disinformation. So we, in a way, do the dirty work, and we have found from the beginning our supporters and the greatest knowledge on the front lines in Ukraine, in Georgia, in the Baltics, and so on. And we can clearly, until now, say that, for example, if we look at the European elections, it makes definitely sense to look at the Ukraine elections now. What is happening in Ukraine will the next day happen, or is already happening in Europe. What our team has struggled from the beginning has been the resources, but now there is some positive light even on that side. We haven't had any budget until today, but now the European Parliament has given through their financials instrument us 1.1 million euros, and we will direct that to comprehensive professional media monitoring of Russia Today and Sputnik, further disinformation analysis and data analysis. So this is clearly a step further for us as a team. And then maybe just one point on the content confusion, and then about the funding, because I also always like to quote the funds that Russia's disinformation machine has behind them. From the state budget, they do give 1 billion euros every year to global media outlets like Russia Today and Sputnik, official state TV channels and news agencies. Then maybe just I think that the risk for the Western countries is that Russia Today, as a media company, is doing professional output, and while it's at the same time used as a channel for disinformation and a propaganda tool, then that exactly creates this confusion in the audiences when they cannot differ that this is actually not, this is not media, this is a propaganda channel, but it's so professionally made that, and it's entertaining, that people buy into it and are ready to get the messages from there.
Great, thank you. So many interesting points that I want to go back to, but I'm thinking of going a little bit back to the advertising space. In America, an average American sees an average number of ads per day. Who thinks it's 2,000? Raise your hand. Who thinks it's more than 4,000? Raise your hand. Right. Because you're getting closer. It's between 4,000 and 10,000 ads per day that an average person sees online per day. So when you think of that constant overload, whether it's political ads or actually journalistic ads or whichever they are, they, based on research, cause irritation. They lead to actually people skipping those ads, especially young people don't even see them when they go through the web, but that kind of behavior has led especially news agencies, media companies thinking about ways of doing ads that are not that pervasive, that are actually more of a storytelling, and brands and, I guess, advertising agencies are kind of finding new ways of also bringing ads that do not look like ads or do not feel like ads. We call them sponsored content or native advertising or whichever you want to call it. But that has kind of led, again, to this confusion when you've got all those different kind of formats that are not always marked or named in the similar kind of way, and people don't know what kind of ad is actually an ad and what is not. And someone was mentioning in an earlier panel that it's possible in those kind of situations that if you don't recognize that brand in which you have that ad, you will not trust it. And based on research, actually, if you see that it is marked as an ad, you will believe that story less that you would if it would not be named as an ad. So ads have a kind of a negative influence, and that can cause confusion. Well, in the EU, we're working strongly in terms of making sure that there's not confusion, that those what our ads are actually called as they are marked. In Finland, this is how it also relates to journalism. We have a strong code of ethics for journalists that any journalist in any media company, most of them apply to these guidelines of journalists. They have to make sure that all that is an ad that is paid by someone else is clearly marked this is an ad. This doesn't happen all in countries in Europe, especially if we go further. There might be more challenges in terms of having these kind of guidelines ruling how journalists do their work. So how do you think, how could we get a similar system to other countries, or do you think that would actually help? Especially if you're not limiting this kind of making things clear that there are ads, if it's not just media, but when you think of advertising companies or tech companies, what could be done so that it is clearer what kind of content they perceive? And you were already mentioning some things in relation to political advertisements and so on. But when you think of the bigger picture, what are the things that can be done to start with?
So there's a very good example of that. There's a growing trend for something called influencer marketing. So the most obvious examples being just like show my age here, so I hope I get it right, Kim Kardashian's and Caitlyn Jenner's. Caitlyn Jenner, is that right? You know the ones, the social influencer personalities. So there's a very big top-tier version of those, and there are actually hundreds of thousands of them throughout the world in different subject areas. And there's been a real pushback around the relationship that they have on their Instagram feeds, YouTube channels, etc., where they're promoting products and not making it clear that they've actually been paid to do so. So strictly speaking, certainly in the UK, you absolutely have to say, this is an advert, this is sponsored. You have to have some kind of recognition around that. To me, frankly, the question of disinformation and the threats to Western society, I think, are most acute with regard to political messaging, and therefore I think, given especially that that's where the regulation is absent, that's where we have to really focus our attention. So what's happening in the UK is the nearest body with responsibility for it, someone called the Electoral Commission, and they're pushing for further rules and powers such that all messages that are paid for on a political message basis have to carry an imprint of who's paying for them. And together with that, you really need all of the full metadata. So that's giving you transparency of where it's coming from. The problem with that is how many layers within organisations can you go? So if you say this message is by the mainstream network, but no one knows who the mainstream network is, how transparent is that? So you really need to have some metadata around the targeting, the content of the message itself, the amount of money being spent, and the true source of the revenue. So on a broader scale, on that basis, Aaron Banks is responsible for the single largest political donation in British history, over 8 million. He still failed to convince the DCMS Select Committee where that money came from. So, and everyone knows that it's probably likely to be somewhere east of Ukraine, but no one's entirely sure where.
All right, comment.
If I can
Yes.
add, and when I say we in the media, we love ads and we utilize them a lot, and especially it's important for independent journalism or small niche projects. We survive on pushing our content and pushing our stories in paying through social media platforms, and probably we now read much more advertising books that we read about journalism per se. The great thing about media using ads that we push our content, but we also add ethics to it, and we should be just completely honest that we're all in the market for attention. Like even in this audience, I think maybe a third of people are looking into their phones now. So it's important to know the tools how you can grab that attention. Not necessarily that your content is boring, although maybe I say something boring, that's also true, but because we're so overloaded with different stories and different content altogether that I don't understand when people say that, it's somehow unethical to put extra effort to push your stories and push your journalism or content out there until that it's transparent. And also in terms of journalism, it's ethical. So you don't push disinformation, you don't push lies out there.
It's very true. And I mean, and there are challenges in platforms that their algorithms are designed to highlight and champion and promote anything that captures attention, the attention economy. And so having that sense of attention is the only metric, unless you introduce additional ethical metrics on top, and it creates potentially real problems where if all you care about is engagement, then a polarizing message that's what you learn from advertising is things like make your message simple, emotions are powerful. Fear and anger don't work so well in advertising. There's not, but they're very powerful emotions, the most powerful emotion. So the problem is you get this polarization and people vanishing down rabbit holes of content that can be very extreme. And I mean, we're seeing things, kind of apolitical examples like the anti-vaxxing stuff and even the flat Earth. I mean, I find fascinating. Things that are unquestionably factually provable are coming back into fashion.
Right. Anneli, do you want to comment? From a perspective of journalism, do you think having more clear guidelines and rules, at least on that side, could help make things more transparent and maybe less challenging in terms of confusion to see what is fact-based journalistic content, what is ad or advertising, and what is propaganda? And in all that sphere?
Well, I guess one of the questions is it enough that the platforms, for example, would be self-regulated? That is a relevant question here? Is if the measures that we see now are enough, or do we need some further steps to actually ensure that we gain the needed transparency and the needed level of transparency that we want to see.
Right. Okay, before moving on to another topic, since you mentioned especially platforms and regulating them and what their role is, and you mentioned Facebook being cooperative, I don't know if you've heard that yesterday Facebook announced that they want to reorientate the company around private, encrypted, and ephemeral messages, pushing, those posts more into the private zone. And I guess in terms of users, that might be a nice thing, that it's more of the private communication. But when you think of regulation, that will get a little harder, I would presume. So what do you think? Would this be an issue? And how can we tackle, again, regulating them if everything in those platforms goes more into the private zone? Do you want to try?
Yeah. Yeah, so it remains to be seen how it plays out.
Right.
I think as I understand it, the focus is around the messaging apps, so the alignment of WhatsApp, Instant Messenger, and another, all owned by Facebook. So I think we have to wait and see. It's one thing to hear a vision. It's another thing to see how it fundamentally plays out. I'm an avid user of WhatsApp. I love WhatsApp. There's obviously no advertising on WhatsApp. There's no data collection on it. It's end-to-end encrypted by default. There are actually moves to introduce advertising to WhatsApp, although it doesn't really affect us in the West because the ads will run on your profile page, which you probably don't even necessarily know what that is. I had to be told what my profile page on WhatsApp was before I realised it.
Right.
But they're actually in different markets, particularly in the developing world, I think in India most acutely, that space is quite often used by individuals or very small sized businesses as almost like a mini website to showcase their wares. So there is a kind of an advertising piece around that. But broadly speaking, if the intent is followed by actions where there is privacy baked in, I think there is absolutely a role for privacy, and I like it in WhatsApp. I would be surprised if it would extend throughout their whole ecosystem, because driving data and engagement that delivers more people more of the time is the raw material that they turn into advertising revenue. So I think it remains to be seen, but we'll certainly watch with interest. But I think the statement's a positive one, but it's walking the walk versus talking the talk is what we'll have to wait for.
I think we should probably differentiate when we talk about regulation. So as a person who's coming from places that were, and still struggle with democracy, I have natural allergy to any regulation because, I know how it ends up. And very often in places, and the majority of our world are not, very consolidated democracies. So in places where we work, regulation always means bad. And even now, we unfortunately see it within the EU. Like, let's take example of Slovakia in a case of murder journalism. And the response that the government had, and now pushing for a special law to kind of address the issues with privacy information, that will stifle the journalism. And a lot of journalists are scared that that kind of regulation that is now kind of sold as disinformation regulation has its goal to suppress freedom of speech. For me personally, working with very aggressive environments, to have as much freedom on social media platform as possible is a good thing, because all our platforms are being attacked very regularly. So the government shut down Twitter, or they shut down YouTube, And you're going to survive only if you are present and on as much platform as possible, including on a privacy end-to-end encryption like WhatsApp, we work there, or Telegram, or elsewhere. So for us, it's important to make a distinction between regulating platforms and the countries where they work under a very healthy, regulation, transparent regulation, but not encourage other agents in other countries take that idea, run with them, and suppress free speech or press freedoms, as if campaign against disinformation, what is happening all over the place, all over front lines globally at the moment.
I think what is also interesting is that the role of Kontaktse, which is like completely, of course, like out of this whole regulation discussion, and it has been considered as an irrelevant and marginal platform in the Western countries. But then, yeah, exactly. But then when you look at the audiences, they have the second biggest audience comes from Germany, according to their own figures. It's around 5%, if Russian one is 48. And it's also 9th most used website in Germany from all the websites. So it has a significant role among the audiences in the West as well. And what has been also a trend in the marginals is that different radical far-right groups that get kicked out from Facebook then move to Kontaktse. And now we just saw in Germany a call to for the audiences to join Kontaktse as a haven of freedom of speech when all the other platforms like Facebook are censoring. And Kontaktse will offer an opportunity before the European elections to express your freedom of speech there. So this is like a small thing, a weak signal, but I think it's interesting that this is happening, and clearly they are pretty actively also developing their audiences on Kontaktse.
I'll tell you more, that not only VK and Kontaktse and OK, which is Odnoklassniki, another Russian social media network, for projects that when we target Russian language audience and audience in Russia, we get more audience for our content from OK than we get from Facebook. Because the audiences that do care about corruption, and both of our audiences, both affected by the disinformation and not affected, they care about simple but shared things like corruption, injustice, inequality in terms of economic inequality. And we get more audience from there. And we're not one of those people who just very patronizing about, VK or OK, those are crazy people, marginalized there. We shouldn't, even address them, or we shouldn't go there because of A, B, C. And we actually wrote out that strategy, and then it's now extremely successful in bringing more attention to what we do, or our partners or journalists on the ground do. So it's absolutely terrific point.
Where do the servers for those? I don't know the sites very well, but I'm guessing they're Russian-based. Are the servers all in Russia?
Yeah, that's a security thing that you do have, because VK and OK, they perform under Russian legislation that now, for example, other international social media networks struggle, that you must store all your information on servers based in Russia. It means that, Secret Service or FSB must full access to whatever. But at the same time, again, it doesn't mean we don't base our communication on VK or OK, but we use it as a delivery platforms because it would be stupid not to do it because of millions of people who sit there.
But it raises the kind of the spectre of something called the splinternet. So the idea of maybe everyone in the audience knows this better than advertising people. So I'm used to speaking to advertising people who don't know as much about technology as me. So I'm suddenly very conscious. Is this a well-known term? So there's obviously a domestic Russian internet, there's a domestic Chinese internet behind the Great Firewall, but by all accounts there are anecdotes of particularly the Chinese making a pitch for how their internet the more kind of regulated authoritarian oversight is quite an attractive proposition as they go out to offer their services and work in partnership with developing world nations.
Because they have an ecosystem.
Yeah,
they have their own Twitter, they own
yeah.
Facebook, they own Google. It's everything.
Yeah, and it's you get all the good bits without any of that difficult freedom of speech stuff. With our version.
They're trying to build the same in Russia as well, because you know that's how you get. But still, millions of people are there.
So yeah,
hundreds of millions of Chinese are there.
So so I guess their home turf is. If you wanted to, it would be very difficult to instigate a kind of a reverse campaign to what has been and continues to be attempted by the Russians in Western democracies of infiltrating the open web and social media that we have here. It's very difficult if we were, imagine this room said, well, let's undertake a disinformation campaign based on inventing, false Russian accounts on their platforms. That really wouldn't work, would it?
I'm going to hijack this conversation and move on a little bit, pretty close to what you were talking about, leading more into propaganda and then repeating something that has been said already, the topic of media literacy. So when thinking of propaganda, we know how it used to be during World War with fires, different kind of leaflets and even newspapers that were used. But when you think of today, we've got all these fake accounts, we've got trolls, we've got what you can name it. It can be infiltrated by being something that represents a media company, but it's not really. We all know how these can affect and even manipulate election results. But when you think of different forms of propaganda, what do you see as the most dangerous source of propaganda? I'll make you think.
Well, I have a specific state actor in mind that I would maybe mention as the most dangerous source of propaganda. But do you mean channels or the?
You can go both ways, because I know some things will be repeated here, both country-wise, but also how it is used and through which channels they spread.
Well, definitely from our point of view, it is Russia, and it has been successfully conducting its disinformation campaigns and exporting them from Russia at least until from 2013 to the US already. So they have gained a lot of experience. They are, if Twitter has deleted 9 or 10 million accounts by Internet Research Agency from St. Petersburg, it means that they have actually created all of these tweets, and they have now gained this experience of how the tactics work, what to do next. So they are pretty capable of conducting even more developed operations in the future. But then what is so often, like a lot of the discussion focuses on social media and the amplification part of the spread of disinformation. But then again, I think that it's also important to simply remember these state channels like Russia Today and Sputnik that might in some countries not be that huge with their audiences, but then there is Russia Today in Spanish and in Arabic, where the audiences clearly do not consider them as propaganda, and many in the West also don't even understand that they originate in Russia. So maybe that point is something that is sometimes undermined from my point of view. May I caution on Russia, although it is a very nasty threat, and my region suffers from specifically Russian, but when I go around and I talk and I use the term organized disinformation first, I do not do geographic division for a specific reason. I use organized disinformation because, let's be honest, we all use kind of disinformation in everyday life. When I run late or when I argue on something and that I know Rihanna is better than Beyonce, but
Then organized disinformation is a different kind of animal. It is a structure, well-financed, organized, that has targets and goals and basically institution. And those institutions are being replicated in so many places now. It's not only Russia. Moreover, Ukraine, for example, suffers from multiple organized disinformation attacks from different geographical places, from Hungary, for example. Even within Europe, everybody replicates those disinformation tactics now all over the place. The Polish government, or in Poland, or in other places, in other regions as well. So I think that when we focus too much on geography, we forget about that all these disinformation campaigns, organized disinformation campaigns, target the fault lines within our democracy, which we all share. And when we do address those issues, whether it's absence of media, or whether it's absence of discussions and debates within our societies, it's no different whether it's Hungarian or Russian or Chinese disinformation campaign. They're all going to be constantly successful and just being, multiplying all over the place, even within the United States, with a lot of, very great examples of disinformation campaigns that are originated and being based in the United States and run by American citizens as well. That's just, not the question of geography so much.
Maybe just to add, why I focus so much on Russia is of course one thing, that it's within our mandate to address Russia's disinformation, but then also simply because it's the only state actor that needs coordinated EU response, and where the goal is also targeting the EU as a whole, to weaken the EU. So I think that it's good to call out the actors behind disinformation, so that then you can actually talk what we are talking about. We are talking about Hungary, Poland, China, Russia, so that we understand that it's just, organized disinformation campaign, but who is the organizer? What is the actor behind? So that was maybe more what I'm after with highlighting Russia.
I don't think that you'll probably be able to answer that question, but the attacks, disinformation attacks on the EU are happening within the EU as well, and within the member states of the EU as well. And again, like the attack on the EU institutions in many countries, starting from Romania, Hungary, and Poland, which also kind of have the same damaging effect, especially in terms of the European elections, that Russian information attacks.
Yeah, I think as a principle, I think the propaganda that you don't realize is propaganda is the most dangerous. The most infuriating propaganda is the one that isn't true, but is getting massive traction.
Oh, yeah.
But I think that moving into kind of a broader piece, there's something about the genie being out of the bottle. So there's a Peter Pomerantsev book. I think I get this right. It's Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And he talks about his experiences in Russia, but how it happened there first, but it's not always their actions. It's the playbook that domestic actors have learnt from. So in an advertising context, some of the dangerous things that are emerging are test and trial of the traction of different kinds of political messaging, and how messages that you think aren't relevant to a subject are used. So, for example, the Vote Leave campaign was actually interviewed by Peter Pomerantsev on the BBC radio. And they said, we micro-targeted, and what we did is we ran all sorts of different ads, and what we found was that animal welfare got a real emotive hook. So they started running ads with pictures of polar bears on melting glaciers, saying the EU is stopping us from saving our polar bears. Right? So that was the kind of messaging you see. So, is that propaganda? It's political advertising, and it's ridiculous. Is that propaganda? Kind of. It's certainly very scary.
Right. This builds a nice bridge to media literacy. The previous panel was more about human nature and what can be and can't be done. And they were saying that while we can be trained, we're not always paying attention and not really focusing on critically thinking, and therefore we might be more susceptible. But according to research, we do need media literacy now more than ever, especially when thinking about differentiating between advertising, propaganda, and journalism. According to a research group from Aalto University and the University of Tampere in Finland, they divided media literacy actually into 4 areas, and they were saying that you have to be more critical about information, you have to be more critical about various meanings attached to content, you have to be critical of various interactions that you have online and offline, and also one layer is the self-perceived criticality. And what they were saying is really to focus on that, and you have way more information about that. But I'm interested in your opinions about how important you find media literacy and whose responsibility media education is. Because in the context, for example, again, using my own country in Finland, we start media education when kids are in kindergarten, and you have that sort of program about media literacy throughout schooling, and that's built in the school programs. But I know it's not like that everywhere. So what do you think? How important is it? Whose responsibility is it? And how useful can it be in terms of differentiating content?
To be honest, I don't know what media literacy is.
All right.
I don't understand this at all, because I do think that it's part of good quality education to teach our kids how to, read, where to read, that there must be sources for information. It doesn't have to be invention of a new wheel or of media literacy or funds being spent, which I think is probably part of the reason why this thing is out there, because it's very easy to fundraise on that. But dealing with the disinformation and effects and fallouts of disinformation every day, professionally and personally, when I come to my family member that has 2 degrees, and that family member is severely affected by disinformation, it's not because they're stupid, it's not because they're being tricked into believing a lie. In 90% of cases, those victims of disinformation, believing a lie is not an accident, it's a choice. And it's a choice because it addresses their fears and their anxieties, because they feel alienated or because they feel frustrated or not heard. And tackling those issues first, making sure that those people feel like they're heard, that the society hears them and addresses their concerns, I think it would work magic in terms of pushing the issue of addressing disinformation, rather any media literacy anywhere else. But that's just my opinion. So I would love to hear if you think it's the case as well.
So there's a couple of really difficult things. I think media literacy is a slightly amorphous kind of phrase, so you have to be careful with it. But I think, to me, the backdrop to it is the rate of change of kind of communications technology and personal devices, right? You used to use words like that a few years ago. Everyone now knows you mean your smartphone, right? If you've ever watched a family interacting around screen usage, you're very clear that the kind of the Western world in particular, the human race, particularly in the Western world, we're in a gigantic experiment. We're in a gigantic social experiment. We're all guinea pigs, because there was never anything, a set out plan for how those technologies and those devices were going to work, and then how the different apps and kind of services on those were designed with people in mind, other than to keep you there, particularly for attention economy businesses. So there's a backdrop of a changing kind of landscape that's changed incredibly quickly, and I really understand what you're saying about kind of illiteracy media illiteracy by someone with 2 degrees is still a possibility that they want to vote into it. And in some respects, children, young adults are very understanding of the technology, know how to use the technology. They understand the dynamics of communications and messaging. But they're also strangely vulnerable to the effects of influencer marketing. So this idea that someone's living a perfect life, right, and all we ever see is the 2% of everyone's life that's the best orchestrated parts of it, and the people who get the most followers and can make a living out of that just feed that all the time. So there are fundamental challenges. What do you do about that? I mean, I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know.
Anneli, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just love the comment. I think this is the first time ever when I hear someone saying I don't support media literacy, because it's like a mantra for media literacy.
I don't say I don't support. I don't understand
yes,
what it
exactly. But yeah, in a way, I think like of course, like these long-term education, like putting a lot of effort into that is necessary, but that doesn't help if we don't have media, like reliable, independent media that will talk about issues, and we will have a fact-based public debate. And that doesn't work if we don't have the social platforms on board, and that doesn't work if still someone is not doing fact checking. So in a way, we just need all the pieces together, and then we can build on that. And media literacy, I think, is like one part of the solution.
That was well put. You were kind of condensing what we've been talking about here so far. My last question, I'll give maximum 1 minute, so we'll be quick enough to wrap up. So anything that you find that is very relevant to this question about whether we talk about advertising, propaganda, or journalism, that something that is relevant to this phenomenon that we haven't discussed yet and you want to finish up with?
Can I finish last then? I gotta think about it.
I'll give you time to think.
Yeah, something that I'm concerned about in the spaces, and you began talking about it, which is the idea of the blurring of lines between them. And actually the one that concerns me very much is the rise of kind of personality cult, or personalities who are kind of journalists, but they're not really journalists. They're kind of, propagandists, but they pretend to be something they're not. And it feeds into strangely into that whole influencer thing, but in a very dark, politically motivated way. So you get, characters like, Tommy Robinson, his kind of pretend name, Stephen Laxley, I can't remember what his proper name is, but he has a huge following that he crowdfunds from, that he, does kind of gonzo YouTube clips around that. And that kind of like, he's a freedom fighter come, activist journalist come, something, it's like that whole thing is very dangerous because of the absence of ethics that go with it, and because of the lack of delineation of things. So it's not my world, but just looking at it, I think that those blurring lines really, really concern me.
Anneli, last words.
Yeah, maybe just so before coming here, I was working as a journalist, and now I have been here for 2 years. I can see people who are really doing the dirty work, and they are doing it every day, and I can feel that quite many people are getting frustrated about this topic. It's very stressful. It's very, just psychologically demanding. And then sometimes I just feel that we have to understand that this is really, really a long-term thing, that we have to, this is how it will be. It will be frustrating every day. It will be stressful. We don't have quick solutions. All the solutions, it's a process and just like a slow process, but still we are heading somewhere, and we have to try. And I don't know, maybe just to motivate myself and the others to keep on trying. At least our team is trying to get the strongest possible EU response against Russia's disinformation, and that's what is needed.
Right.
Where it starts for me personally, this whole mess, is that when I have a conversation, I don't know why and how it happened, that somehow we think that journalism is very cheap and it's very easy to do. but it's not. It's very expensive. It should be very expensive. And it starts with conversation that I regularly have with some journalists that ask me, for example, should we hire for this project a fact checker? And journalists that do ask those things are not usually from Moldova or Ukraine, from United States or UK. And I'm shocked by it because fact checking is a core of your function as a journalist. That shouldn't be a separate job. And I think it's a fallout and legacy of those 2-3 decades that we let our journalism institution to just go waste in terms of defunding them, denying them much opportunity. The market is also responsible for that. But then once we fix this, once we make sure that journalism, again, is a high-paying job that you invested a lot in terms of resources and money as well, I think we'll get to the bottom of a problem and start fixing it. Until then, until the journalist doesn't know what fact-checking and thinks is a separate job, I think we're all in massive problem, and we will never be able to address this information.
Right. I totally agree that we need more transparency in terms of how journalism works and what kind of work is behind every piece of fact-checked news. Perfect. Thank you so much for your attention. We're wrapping up now. So following this session, you'll have a brief coffee break, and the next session will begin promptly at 3:45. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.